So what exactly are carbon markets and how do you participate in them, or where do you start? That's what we get to answer on this episode as we delve into the complexities or the simplicities of carbon markets. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO, Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa. So you've probably heard of carbon markets and you're wondering, what is this thing that everyone is raging about and everyone is excited about or confused about, because there's an equal measure of that. And on this episode, we hope to break it down for you and help you understand. So first of all, let's go back to a bit of a recap of how we arrive at the carbon markets. The reason why carbon markets exist is because there's carbon emissions. And the reason why carbon emissions exist is because there's climate change. And we've explained before in previous episodes that climate change happens when over a period of time, the weather patterns begin to significantly change, like we said, over probably a period of 35 years. When you compare the previous 35 years and this 35 years, and you notice significant weather patterns that result to global warming, meaning that there are global gas emissions that result to the warming of the atmosphere. And then that results to increased carbon emissions, because carbon will always be emitted, but then there's a significant increase that leads to a lot warmer temperatures than previously. So in the process of climate change that happens over a period of time, there's a lot of gases that are emitted into the atmosphere, like we said. So this, for the most part, there are different kinds of gases. There's methane and there's carbon dioxide. But generally, we use the word carbon to be able to explain when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So we say carbon emissions. Now, when carbon is emitted, there's a need to be able to either remove, avoid, or reduce carbon. You probably hear that quite a bit. And there are different ways of doing that. So when it comes to carbon reduction and carbon avoidance, for example, instead of like using cement in building a house, you can use other materials. That means that you can avoid the carbon emissions that would otherwise have been there when you were using, say, cement, for example, or you use renewable energy in place of fossil fuels, which means that you avoid it completely. And then when it comes to reduction, it's putting measures in place to make sure that the amount of carbon that would have been emitted is significantly reduced. And that could happen maybe through, biochar, for example, or other methods that allow you to be able to reduce the amount of carbon that would be emitted into the atmosphere. When it comes to carbon removals, there's a more complex process, and that will probably happen through technology or nature-based solutions. In the case of technology, you use something that is called direct air capture or other methods that absorb carbon from the air and either store it permanently into the ground or direct air capture. So over time, there had to be ways in which people are either, I wouldn't say penalized, but they are made to pay for the emissions that they have emitted. And they do so by acquiring carbon credits, which means that these are permits. They're called permits that allow for you to be able to pay for what you have emitted using someone else or trading with someone else who's actually producing carbon credits. And carbon credits are those permissions that are given to this. And it's used, there's a method that is used called cap and trade. Cap and trade means that you cap, let's say there's an allocation per either organization or country that allows you to have a certain level of carbon emissions. But when it comes to an excess of that, you're allowed to trade those emissions, or you're allowed to pay for those emissions by buying carbon credits. Carbon credits are generated through carbon projects that range or address the issue of either reducing, avoiding, or removing carbon emissions or carbon in general. So now that we've understood what carbon credits are, we need to be able to understand what carbon markets are. So carbon markets are basically that mechanism that allows for the buying and selling of carbon credits. So the person who's producing the credits, maybe that farmer who's planting trees, or the one that's using biochar to absorb carbon from the air, or that project developer who set up a huge direct air capture plant and has a carbon sequestration or a carbon mineralization, which means storing carbon in the ground. Those kind of projects, they produce credits, and there's a way that they are measured in terms of to be able to arrive at the quantity of carbon credit that has been produced per project or per area or per per region, for example. And so the ones that produce that have then the right to be able to sell to the one that needs to reduce their carbon emissions. And for the most part, that will probably be people from the global north or areas where they've increased their emissions. For example, companies that deal with fossil fuels, and this could range from petroleum, those that actually invest in extracting the extractives, for example, whether it's mining or the ones that actually extract oil from the ground or gas from the ground and result to carbon emissions. When they do that, they are supposed to then come and buy the carbon credits. So they'll come and buy, and you're probably wondering, do they just walk in and buy? We'll get to that shortly. So the carbon markets is that complex, or rather that platform or that mechanism that allows this exchange to happen. And so the organizations or countries that have developed on the backbone of fossil fuels or are in industries that have produced significant emissions need to do something called carbon offset. And that means basically cap and trade, right? So you've been capped at a certain level in terms of your emissions, but then the extra emissions or surplus emissions you're allowed to buy to be able to offset your carbon emissions. And so when they come to buy, there are ways or methods or methodologies that they are used or they can access, ways in which they can access the market. Carbon markets are divided into two markets. The first one is called the voluntary carbon market, and then the other one is called the compliance carbon markets. The voluntary carbon markets is the one where it's dependent on the buyer and seller. There are no regulations, there's no standard price, there's nothing that determines how much the buyer will buy it at or what kind of carbon credits will be used, etc. And so for the most part, this market has been predominantly what has been operating in the African context. And if you remember in the Nairobi Declaration, one of the issues that has become significantly a thorny issue or an area of concern for many African countries is that there's a need to be able to put measures in place to make sure that the indigenous communities or the local communities that are normally used to be able to produce these carbon credits in the case of nature-based solutions, all projects that are adopted or implemented in the continent that result to carbon credits are compensated fairly by the purchasers or by the buyers. The voluntary carbon markets is basically freelance or free for anyone to be able to participate. However, for you to buy carbon credits, there has to be a verification and an auditing process. This is done by companies that are called verifiers or carbon verifiers or auditors. They basically come in and they're able to review the carbon credits. And this, let me give an example of how this happens. So you have an agriculture project that uses, say, just a smallholder farmers, for example, and they're using certain methods to regenerate the soil. Like we said, soil is one of the ways in which you can sequester carbon. So they're using certain kinds of methods. And because of using those kinds of methods, even planting trees, for example, it results to decarbonization, for example. And so when you're measuring, there's a way that you measure to check the quality of the carbon, depending on how long it's going to last. For example, if you plant trees, and the trees are cut down after a couple of years, for example, it could result to, it's not perceived to be a high quality carbon because the idea is that for the most part, when a carbon is bought, it's bought for a certain period of time. The oil company will come and buy and say that the average years for which they're paying for that credit or those credits is, say, 50 years. But over the process of 50 years, this farmer could die, their son could take over, child could take over, and basically the trees could be destroyed, or they could decide to construct a building in that place. And yet the company or the organizations that paid for the credits have been accounted to say that they are, say, carbon neutral, or they've offset their carbon surplus. And yet the project in which they invested is not existing anymore, maybe 5 years or 10 years down the line, or even 3 years down the line. So the issue of quality comes into play. The issue of permanence also comes into play. You'll hear this a lot when it comes to carbon markets. Permanence meaning that when it's a direct air capture, for example, project that absorbs air and is able to store that carbon into the ground, which is called mineralization, that's more permanent because it's considered that it can stay there thousands of years. which means that that's a more permanent and more assured way of decarbonizing compared to, say, nature-based solutions such as planting trees or land use solutions that allow for, say, like I said, biochar or other methods that allow for regeneration of the soil. And that could be only last maybe for a year or two or even less. So that comparison comes into place when it comes to designing or defining what a quality carbon is. And there are other ways in which a quality carbon can be measured. But let's go back to the process. So when the verifiers check it, and this process could take up to sometimes even 18 months, depending on who's auditing. And for the Africans in the room, one of the things that we need to know is that we do not have standards in the carbon markets in Africa. And that's one of the areas that could be a job creating opportunity or an opportunity for people to be able to get into when it comes to auditing or verifying carbon credits. So the reason why the voluntary carbon markets has been quite dicey is because, like I said, it's not regulated. And so sometimes you don't know what's going on. You don't know who's buying the credits and all that. And so there's a lot of conversation around should the African continent adopt their own form of regulations. And I know that, for example, in Kenya, there are quite a bit of, there's an ongoing process of putting in place carbon regulations that will allow for the government and for there to be more regulation when it comes to tracking who is doing the projects, are the communities benefiting, etc. Rwanda is set to launch its own carbon markets regulations at COP28 later this year in a month's time. And their carbon project or their regulation is anchored around a floor price. And floor price means, like I said, in the voluntary market, it's really open to the buyer and seller, dependent on quality, and quality could be defined by whoever is auditing. And there could be a lot of loopholes in that case. And so Rwanda is seeking to put in place, using blockchain technology, put in place measures of ways to track the projects in the first place, to track the source of the credits, to track the value of the credits, and there is a push to put in place a floor price, which means that when you come to buy, there's a range between X% and this other percentage. Right now, the conversation is around $30 to $80 per credit. And whether that will pass or other countries will adopt it is left to be seen, especially ahead of the COP28. Carbon credits are a source of revenue or income, not just for the local communities, but for the country and for the governments in place. And so that's why, like I said, at the Africa Climate Summit, it was a big deal. And it continues to be a conversation that's going on between developers and countries, between the global north and the global south, as there's a discussion around how do we leverage carbon credits to be able to improve the revenue or the income for the developing countries in the global south. The second market is called compliance market. The compliance market is predominantly regulated. The prices are much higher because it's considered that because of the regulations, the quality of the carbon is quite high. And so there's better chances of you getting better value in terms of prices for the one that's buying and also for the local communities. And this market is predominantly in the global north specifically, and different markets like the EU has its own framework that's called the European Union Emissions Trading System. And there are others as well, but the characteristic of the compliance market is that it's largely regulated to safeguard the government, the indigenous communities or the local communities, and the buyer as well. For example, one of the things that we need to know is the voluntary carbon markets last year fetched $2 billion in the trading, because of the value, like I said, the quality of the carbon, the value of it resulted to, in the trading process, $2 billion. But guess how much was traded in the compliance carbon markets? 985 billion. And so there are conversations and discussions around, should the global market be regulated? And that's an ongoing conversation, and we'll keep you posted on that as it evolves. In the meantime, what you do need to know is that regardless of how it goes, there is an interest and an increasing one in the carbon market space. And you as a young person needs to know what the opportunities are. And because our lens at Jacobs Ladder Africa is focused on the job opportunities, this is what you need to know as options or some of the ideas ideas of the jobs that you could get into. The first one is get informed about the jobs, about the framework rather, and about the general market or the landscape when it comes to carbon markets. Keep abreast because it is an evolving area, and so the opportunities will emerge even as the process unfolds. The second one is you could look at solutions that enable the trading. There is no globally or even continentally or nationally agreed platform when it comes to trading. There are different organizations that are doing that, so that could be another area. And like I said in a previous episode, perhaps for us in Africa who've largely use mobile money, that could be another way of you intersecting or introducing the use of mobile money to pay for carbon credits. There are many opportunities and there are many ways in which you can participate. But the first thing that you need to know is get informed, get skilled, and then get specialized with specific areas that resolve or provide a solution and value when it comes to carbon markets in general. So that's it. Today we were hoping to just give you a glimpse of Carbon Markets 101. We hope that you have learned something. You've learned what climate change is, what carbon credits are, how they're measured, and what carbon markets are, the two types of carbon markets, and how you as an individual can participate in them. There is so much information out there, and I hope that you will use this as an appetizer for you to be able to go into the details and find out what this opportunity is and how you as a young person can make yourself relevant by offering value or increasing your value in the carbon market space. Thank you for watching, and thank you for sharing your feedback. Thank you for engaging us. Thank you for keeping us posted. Thank you for all the questions that you've been sending our way. It does encourage us and it does help us to know how to make this better and more relevant for you as one that follows us. And please do share, like, and comment on this video. Subscribe to this channel so that you're able to get more updates immediately when we release them. My name is Sellah Bogonko, co-founder and CEO Jacob's Ladder Africa, and this is Green Jobs Africa.